Welcome back to First in Preparedness. And on this episode, we're going to discuss what it takes to keep one of these running. Now, let's say you've gone out, you've purchased your AR15, you've purchased 500 rounds of ammunition stored nicely, you've bought a nice optic for your rifle, you of course have gone out and also picked up a weapon light, and of course a sturdy sling. Beyond that, you have also purchased 5 additional magazines, which is the minimum that I would suggest for being prepared. And let's say shit actually does hit the fan. Well, guess what? There's some additional parts you should probably keep on hand to make sure this keeps running. Now, what are those? Well, let me go back into some of the philosophy that I use in terms of weapon systems. Now, all of the AR platforms that I currently own are all direct gas impingement, and all of them can accept mil-spec parts. Well, that does something easy for me. I can replace parts from any rifle by swapping them with one or the other, pending there's no headspace issues. Haven't seen those yet. But beyond that, don't get me wrong, I would love to have like a fleet of SIG Spears or LWRC piston guns, but I ain't that rich. So instead, I've gone with the philosophy that I need to get basically all my weapons need to share mil-spec parts. This does a couple of different things. In the event shit hits the fan and I needed to pick up parts, find parts, scavenge parts, more than likely those parts are going to be mil-spec, and more than likely they will fit in my firearms. But we would not like to get to that point. In the event Joe Biden conscripts, 11 million illegal immigrants and basically grants him citizenship to become an army to hunt you down, well, better make sure this runs quite well. So with that, let's get into the different types of parts you may want to purchase beyond just your basic rifle. So let's get into it. Let's look at the first most basic spare parts that you should have for your AR and on you at all times. The first of those being a mil-spec bolt. This is the one thing that is the heart of the weapon. Without this, it doesn't fire. Next thing that you should keep with you, of course, is a firing pin. Now, I have not had too many of these ever break. In fact, I've had none of them ever break. But if you ever chip the end here, probably going to need to replace that firing pin. Now, let's look at this little item here, your bolt. Now, between this and your cam pin, these are the most abused parts on your gun. And of course, they're consequently probably the most important. If you look at what these things go through, I mean, these are like, if you look at the cam pin or this bolt, I mean, it's abused like a set of genitals on an adolescent that just discovered masturbation. They are beat absolutely to shit. Consequently, this is usually the point of failure that you see on an AR-15, whether that be, these lugs particularly breaking off or the bolt breaking in half where the cam pin actually goes through. So, it's a good idea to keep one of these as a spare part on you at all times. And conveniently, if you have either a BCM or a Magpul hand grip, they can fit nicely in here and they can be taken up space with some nice ear protection to stop them from rattling around, as I described in an earlier video. Now, these are the most basic spare parts that you should have on hand and with you at all times. Now, that is just for one weapon. Let's say you have multiple systems. It's probably a good idea to keep at least one bolt on hand for all of your AR platforms. An even better strategy would be to keep an entire bolt carrier group. However, I do understand that, in this inflated times and economic woes, we may not have the money to keep an entire bolt carrier group on hand. Well, let's take a quick look at what this thing actually goes through and why it's, this particular piece here being the cam pin and the bolt takes so much abuse. When this bolt or bolt carrier group is in the forward position and there is a round chambered and the gun goes off, of course, gas goes through this gas key and into a small chamber here. Now what that chamber does is actually starts to move the bolt carrier group back first. The bolt stays in place. However, you see where this cam pin rides, there's a little slope here. Well, that does some very violent things to the bolt. The bolt itself has been turned, to interlock with the chamber. So the first thing that happens as that bolt starts to go back is that cam pin starts to run into this slope here. Well, that causes two different forces to be applied to the bolt. The first one being back, so it's actually pushing these lugs back against the edge of that chamber, and it's also trying to twist that bolt to unlock it. So this is being abused badly. Not only that, the cam pin is also taking a pretty fair amount of abuse as well, running into this slope here where the cam rides. So that is why this bolt and this cam pin take so much abuse. Now let's take a look at some other pieces you may want to keep on hand aside from a bolt, a firing pin, or if you can afford it, an entire bolt carrier group. Now, if you look at the cost of this bolt, these can range all over the place. Something like a Colt or BCM is going to run you between $80 and $100. Something like a Landtac, that's a little bit better steel, maybe a 9130 versus a Carpenter 158, that's going to run you about $115. Or you can buy some mil-spec ones roughly in the $60 range for a bolt. You can also go real cheap. I think PSA has these for, I don't know, I want to say like 30, 40 bucks or something like that. Is that reliable? I don't know. I always tend to go for like a BCM, something that's been MPI tested, something that I know is going to work in any weapon that I have. Now, of course, the question is going to come up of head spacing. I've never had an issue with head spacing. I do have head space gauges. I do typically run a go or no-go on, a given barrel, but more than likely, if you're starting with a brand new bolt and you're on a used barrel, probably not going to have an issue. However, it is a good idea to stuff a headspace bolt, headspace gauge in there and check to see if it's go or no go. More than likely, you need to check headspace on new barrels, since that is typically where the, QC issues are going to happen. So pick yourself up a bolt if you can afford it. Now, if you do pick up a bolt, and let's say you don't have the, money right now to buy a complete bolt carrier group, there are ways you can purchase this and then also get additional parts that are basically rebuild kits for that. And we're going to cover that right now. The one thing that typically does break on AR15 bolts is, of course, the extractor springs. This is an extractor spring kit. I think it's from BCM. Very easily replaceable. Now, if you have one of these, you should also probably purchase one of these, which is a spare extractor. That, of course, goes with that. They also sell, I'll have to find it, I have several of them right now, but you also should probably look at investing in maybe the roll pin that also goes with that as well. The other thing that I would suggest buying for your bolt is, of course, sets of gas rings. Gas rings do wear out over time. It takes a lot of rounds to wear some out. I don't think I've ever worn out any, but I know that this rifle and possibly the other Palmetto State Armory rifle that I have a lot of rounds through them are probably nearing the life of their gas rings. These are very, very easy to change out. Basically just takes a pick. The other things you may want to pick up are, of course, the ejector spring and the ejector pin itself. I don't have any of those right now. I'm probably going to order some here pretty quickly. I haven't heard too many stories of ejector springs or parts issues. I know there's probably been some in the past, and I will pick them up. Now, if you look at the relative cost of this, a spare extractor is maybe $10 or $12. Extractor spring kit is probably right around $1.75 up to $5. Gas ring kits are about $1.75. Extractor or ejector springs, I don't know, 75 cents to 80 cents. So right here, you can rebuild your bolt basically for relatively small amount of money, and these parts are something you should have on hand. Like I said, I usually carry these in the rifle themselves, ready to go. But beyond that, if I ever have to repair anything, I want these extra parts. Now, what are some other parts that you may want to consider keeping in your inventory? Let's go on. A few other parts that you may want to pick up is, of course, the cotter pin that's for retaining your firing pin. Those are something that you probably want to keep a few extra on hand, simply for the fact that if you field strip the weapon, there's a high probability that you could potentially lose this. The other thing that you may want to pick up is some of the cam pins. Now, as I stated before, this is another one of those heavily abused parts that resides within this bolt carrier group right here. Pick up a couple of these. They're about $4 or $5 a piece, but they will stop the rifle from working if they break. Another potential part that you may want to keep on hand is an additional buffer spring. Now, these do wear out in the gun, especially if it's like a mil-spec rifle spring or something like that. This particular one is I've been pretty big fan of these. These are Springco's. They sell several different weights or spring rates that you can purchase. I think this one is the enhanced power buffer spring. So a little bit heavier if I'm running something suppressed with a heavier buffer. I tend to run a little bit heavier spring in it. Also, there is a spec in which I can't remember what it is off the top of my head, but something like if the free length of the spring shortens up to, I don't know if it was 10 1/4 inches, but if your buffer spring is shorter free length than, like, I think it's 10 1/4 inches, you need to replace it. These run about $20 a piece. I run them in all my guns. I've been happy with them. They can somewhat help in recoil and things like that. Between balancing your buffer and your spring is probably critical to proper ejection. So look into that. Maybe I'll do another episode on that later on. But these are some basic parts that you should keep on hand to keep your gun running. Beyond that, you may also want to invest in a spare charging handle. Not that those break very often, but I have a few extra laying around in the event mine actually goes down. Lastly, one other thing you may want to keep in your kit is, of course, an additional mil-spec trigger group. I've never seen a trigger group go down. I've got a few of these spares left over from some of the builds that I've done, so I keep them on hand. I also keep a few trigger pins and hammer pins in that kit as well. Once again, I've never heard of those breaking, especially not the anti-walk ones. I've had some issues with some of the ones that you screw in. I've had those break on some of the cassette triggers that I've utilized in the past. So that's it. That is my take on some of the spare parts you should keep on hand if you want to keep your AR-15 running and shit has hit the fan. As I always say, well, folks, there it is. The parts that you need to keep your AR-15 running in the event shit hits the fan. And as Wendy's always said, parts is parts.
That's like when they take a lot of chickens and assemble the respective parts. What parts? What parts?
Different parts.
Parts is parts.
Well, parts are not always exactly parts. Do try to get some quality parts or quality replacement parts for your AR-15. With that, thank you for tuning in here to First in Preparedness, and we'll see you soon on the next episode.